January 15th, 1944, the assignment. The morning air was biting, the kind that clawed at your lungs with every breath. Snow lay thick across the ground, a blanket of white that stretched into the horizon, unbroken except for the twisted remains of trees and the blackened skeletons of buildings. The war had ravaged this land, leaving it a desolate wasteland, and yet, somehow, life persisted. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, trying to ward off the cold that had settled into my bones. The winter of 1944 was harsher than I remembered, but maybe that was because I had been out here too long, fighting a war that had long since lost any semblance of glory or purpose. Marcus, a voice called out from behind me. I turned to see Hauptmann Richter, our commanding officer, striding through the snow toward me, his breath visible in the frigid air. Yes, sir, I responded, snapping to attention. The discipline that had been drilled into me since the early days of the war was automatic, even now when it all felt so pointless. Richter handed me a folded piece of paper. New orders. You're being reassigned to a special unit. Sniper detail. I took the paper, my gloved fingers numb as I unfolded it. The words were short and to the point, typical of the Wehrmacht's communications. I was to report to a location near the outskirts of Leningrad, where I would join a small group tasked with taking out high-value targets. The Soviets had been pushing hard, and command wanted every advantage they could get, even if it meant sending men like me to do the dirty work. Congratulations, Richter said, though his tone lacked any real enthusiasm. He knew as well as I did that being reassigned to sniper detail wasn't exactly a reward. It was a death sentence, one where the only thing you could count on was a long wait in the cold before you pulled the trigger. Your transport leaves in an hour. Pack light. I nodded, already feeling the weight of the assignment settling on my shoulders. Sniper work was solitary, cold, and dangerous. You were alone with your rifle, your only companion the enemy you were hunting. And once you pulled that trigger, once you saw the life drain from the eyes of the man through your scope, you were never the same. I returned to my quarters, a makeshift barrack that had once been a farmhouse before the war turned it into a military outpost. The roof leaked, and the walls did little to keep out the cold, but it was better than sleeping in the snow. Inside, a few of the men were huddled around a small stove, the only source of warmth in the place. They looked up as I entered, their faces hollow and weary. "Where you off to?" Voss, one of them, asked. A man named Klaus, who had been with me since the early days of the Eastern Front. "Got new orders," I replied, tossing my gear onto my cot. "Sniper detail." Klaus whistled low. "They really sending you out there alone? Christ, that's rough." I shrugged, trying to keep my expression neutral. "It's what I signed up for, isn't it?" "Yeah, but that doesn't make it any easier," he said, shaking his head. "Be careful out there, Marcus. Those Soviets aren't playing games." I knew that all too well. The Soviets fought like men possessed, driven by a hatred that burned hotter than the cold we faced. They had every reason to fight with such ferocity we had invaded their homeland, burned their villages, and killed their people. They were fighting for survival, and that made them dangerous. I packed my gear with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. My rifle, a Carabiner 98,000 fitted with a ZF-42 scope, was the first thing I prepared. I checked the scope, adjusted the settings, and ran a cloth over the barrel. It was my lifeline out there, more reliable than any man. My rations, a few spare clips of ammunition, and a small medkit followed. I had learned early on to travel light. Carrying too much only slowed you down. As I finished packing, I allowed myself a moment to think about what lay ahead. Sniper duty was different from anything else in this war. It wasn't about charging enemy lines or holding positions. It was about patience, precision, and the ability to pull the trigger without hesitation. It was about killing from a distance, where you could see your target's face just before they died. I left the barracks without saying much. The men gave me nods of acknowledgement, but there were no words of encouragement. We all knew what this war had become. The days of brotherhood and camaraderie were long gone, replaced by a grim acceptance of the reality we faced. We were all just trying to survive. The transport was waiting when I arrived, a half-track idling in the snow, its engine rumbling quietly. I climbed in, joining a few other soldiers who were being reassigned to various posts. None of them spoke as the vehicle lurched forward, heading toward the front lines. As we traveled, I couldn't help but think about the men I would be targeting. They were just soldiers like me, men who had been pulled into this nightmare by forces beyond their control. But I couldn't let that thought linger. In this war, it was kill or be killed. The moment you hesitated, the moment you let doubt creep in, was the moment you died. The half-track rolled to a stop near a bombed-out building on the outskirts of Leningrad. The city had been under siege for years, a brutal and bloody conflict that had reduced much of it to rubble. The smell of death hung in the air, mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke. "Welcome to the front," the driver said as he let us out. "Good luck." I nodded, slinging my rifle over my shoulder as I stepped out into the snow. The wind cut through me like a knife, but I barely noticed. My mind was already focused on the mission ahead. I would find my target, and I would take him out. That was the only way to survive. As I made my way to the sniper's nest that had been prepared for me, I couldn't help but think about how far I had come since the start of this war. Back then, I had believed in the cause, in the glory of battle. But now, all I wanted was to see it end, one way or another. And if that meant pulling the trigger one more time, so be it. The war had taken everything from me, but it hadn't taken my will to survive. As long as I had that, I would keep fighting. I would keep killing. Because in the end, that was all I knew how to do. January 20th, 1944, first kill of the year. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over the desolate landscape. The snow-covered ruins of Leningrad stretched out before me, a city that had been reduced to a ghostly reminder of what it once was. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant boom of artillery or the crack of a rifle. It was a world of death and decay, where life clung on only in the most desperate of places. I lay prone on the icy floor of what had once been a grand office building, now a crumbling shell. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, and the windows had long since been shattered. I had taken up position on the third floor, where the roof had partially collapsed, giving me a clear view of the street below. My rifle rested on a pile of rubble, the scope trained on a distant intersection where Soviet troops had been spotted. My breath misted in the air as I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my movements controlled. The cold had settled into my bones, but I forced myself to ignore it. I had been in position for hours, waiting for the right moment. Patience was the key to being a sniper. You couldn't rush these things. You had to wait, to let the enemy reveal themselves before you struck. Through the scope, I scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. The Soviets had been using this route to move supplies, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they passed through again. My orders were clear: disrupt their supply lines by any means necessary, and that meant taking out anyone who came into my sights. My finger hovered near the trigger as I watched. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in those moments of waiting. Every sound, every flicker of movement could be the enemy. My senses were heightened, every nerve on edge. Then I saw a shadow moving along the edge of a building across the street. I adjusted the scope, focusing in on the figure. It was a Soviet soldier, moving cautiously, his rifle held at the ready. He was followed by two more, then a fourth. They were making their way toward the intersection, their breath visible in the frigid air as they trudged through the snow. I steadied my breathing, aligning the crosshairs on the lead soldier's chest. He was young, probably no older than 20, with a hardened expression that belied his age. I wondered briefly who he was, where he was from, what his life had been like before the war. But I couldn't let myself dwell on that. He was the enemy, and my job was to kill him. The moment came, that perfect window of opportunity where everything lined up. My finger squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked against my shoulder as the shot rang out. The crack of the rifle echoed through the ruins, startling birds from their perches and sending a chill through the air. Through the scope, I saw the soldier collapse, the life snuffed out of him in an instant. The other Soviets reacted immediately, diving for cover, but it was too late for them to save their comrade. His body lay in the snow, blood seeping into the white blanket beneath him, a stark contrast that was both haunting and mesmerizing. I quickly reloaded, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. The second soldier was trying to drag his fallen comrade to safety, exposing himself in the process. Another squeeze of the trigger, and he, too, fell. The third and fourth soldiers had taken cover behind a wall, out of my line of sight. I stayed still, waiting, knowing they would have to move eventually. Sniping was a game of patience. A deadly waiting game where the first to lose their nerve would be the first to die. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The wind picked up, howling through the broken windows and making the ruins creak and groan. I kept my scope trained on the corner of the wall, knowing they would try to make a run for it. Suddenly, the third soldier bolted from his cover, making a dash for the nearest building. I tracked him, leading the shot, and fired. The bullet caught him in the back, and he crumpled to the ground, his momentum carrying him a few more steps before he fell face first into the snow. The fourth soldier didn't move. He was smart, staying hidden, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I had been doing this for too long to fall for that. I remained still, keeping my rifle trained on the area where he was hiding. I knew the pressure would get to him eventually. The fear, the uncertainty it would make him reckless. Sure enough, after what felt like an eternity, the fourth soldier peeked out from behind the wall, just a fraction of his head visible as he tried to gauge the situation. It was all I needed. I took the shot, and he dropped instantly, joining his comrades in the snow. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. The street was now littered with the bodies of the soldiers I had killed, their blood staining the pure white snow. I watched through the scope for a moment longer, making sure there were no other threats, before finally lowering my rifle. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline. No matter how many times I did this, it never got easier. Killing from a distance, where you could see every detail of your target, where you could watch the life drain from their eyes, it was different from the chaotic madness of close combat. It was personal. I knew I should feel something: regret, guilt, sorrow, but all I felt was numbness. I had learned to shut off my emotions, to become a machine when I was out here. It was the only way to survive. If I let myself feel, if I let myself think about what I was doing, it would destroy me. I stayed in position for a while longer, watching the street, but no more soldiers appeared. The mission was accomplished, the supply route disrupted, at least for now. I would have to move soon, before the Soviets sent reinforcements or another sniper to hunt me down. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't help but think about the young man I had killed first. He had probably been conscripted, forced into this hellish war, just like I had been. We were on opposite sides, but in the end, we were both just pawns in a larger game, one that cared nothing for our lives. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and made my way down the crumbling staircase of the building, each step echoing through the empty halls. The cold air bit at my face as I stepped outside, the snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back at the bodies in the street. There would be more tomorrow, more the day after that. The war wasn't ending anytime soon. As I trudged through the snow, heading toward the rendezvous point where I would meet up with the rest of my unit, I tried to push the images from my mind. The faces, the blood, the feeling of pulling the trigger, I buried it all deep inside, where it couldn't reach me. But no matter how hard I tried, I knew it would all come back when I closed my eyes tonight. The war had a way of haunting you, even in sleep. And so I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And I couldn't afford to feel, not if I wanted to survive. January 25th, 1944, shadows in the snow. The days had begun to blur together, one indistinguishable from the next. The cold was relentless, seeping into every crevice, every joint, until it felt like my entire body was made of ice. The sun, when it appeared, was a distant, pale orb that offered no warmth, only a brief reprieve from the darkness that dominated the winter months on the Eastern Front. I had moved to a new position, deeper into the city, closer to where the fighting was fiercest. The Soviets were pressing hard, their assaults coming in wave after wave, relentless and brutal. The sound of artillery was a constant backdrop, a dull roar that echoed through the ruins, punctuated by the staccato of machine gun fire and the occasional scream of a dying man. My new post was in what had once been a school, now a shattered ruin. The roof had caved in and the walls were crumbling, but it offered a good vantage point over a stretch of road the Soviets were using to move their troops. I had spent the last 2 days here, lying in wait, waiting for the enemy to make their move. The school was a haunting place, even by the standards of this war. The walls were still decorated with faded posters of smiling children, their bright colors now dulled by dust and grime. A few desks and chairs lay scattered across the floor, broken and overturned, relics of a time before the war had come and torn this place apart. In one corner, I had found a chalkboard, still bearing the remnants of a lesson scrawled in Russian, the words barely legible through the layers of dust. I tried not to think about what had happened to the children who had once filled these halls. I had seen enough in this war to know that their fates had likely been as grim as anyone else's. This place, like so many others, had been swallowed by the maw of war, leaving only ghosts behind. The morning had been quiet, eerily so. I had seen a few Soviet patrols pass by, but they had stayed out of range, moving cautiously through the ruins. They were learning, adapting to the presence of snipers like me, making our job that much harder. But I knew they would have to move more troops eventually, and when they did, I would be ready. The wind had picked up, howling through the broken windows and sending flurries of snow swirling through the air. I huddled deeper into my coat, trying to conserve what little warmth I had. My rifle lay ready in front of me, the scope already trained on the road below. I had adjusted the sights the night before, making sure everything was in perfect alignment. In this kind of work, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of distant gunfire. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I had to force myself to stay alert. The cold had a way of dulling your senses, lulling you into a dangerous state of lethargy. But I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Not here, not now. As the afternoon dragged on, I finally saw movement. A column of Soviet soldiers appeared at the far end of the road, moving cautiously through the snow. They were a mixed group, some carrying rifles, others lugging equipment or dragging sleds laden with supplies. I counted at least 20 of them, too many to take out all at once. I would have to pick my targets carefully. I watched them through the scope, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. They were moving slowly, their eyes scanning the buildings on either side of the road, wary of snipers like me. They had good reason to be cautious. The ruins of Leningrad were a sniper's paradise, full of hiding spots and vantage points that could turn any street into a killing ground. I let them get closer, waiting for the right moment. My breath was steady, my heart beat slow. I had learned to control these things, to remain calm even when the adrenaline was surging through my veins. The first shot was the most important. It had to be perfect. The column was about halfway down the road when I spotted my target, an officer, near the middle of the group, his rank insignia visible even from this distance. He was the one in charge, the one giving the orders. Taking him out would throw the rest into chaos, make them easier to pick off. I adjusted my aim, centering the crosshairs on his chest. He was talking to another soldier, unaware of the danger he was in. My finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the empty streets. I saw the officer stumble, a look of shock on his face as the bullet struck him. He fell to the ground, his blood staining the snow around him. The rest of the column reacted immediately, diving for cover, shouting orders, their eyes wide with fear. I had thrown them into disarray, just as I had planned. They didn't know where the shot had come from, and in their panic, they made mistakes. I took out 2 more soldiers in quick succession, each shot precise and deadly. They were trying to drag the officer's body out of the line of fire, but I wasn't going to give them the chance. Another shot, and one of the men fell, clutching his side as he crumpled to the ground. The rest had managed to find cover by now, hiding behind the remains of a wall or in the doorways of buildings. But I wasn't done yet. I shifted my aim to a soldier who had taken refuge behind a fallen column, his head just barely visible as he tried to peek out. I fired, and the bullet punched through the column, striking him in the head. He collapsed, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he fell into the snow. The remaining soldiers were trapped, pinned down by my fire. They didn't dare move, didn't dare expose themselves. I could hear their frantic shouts, their desperate attempts to communicate with each other. They were scared, and fear made them predictable. I waited, my rifle steady, my eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. I knew they would try to retreat, to fall back and regroup. It was the logical thing to do, but I wasn't going to let them get away that easily. Sure enough, one of them broke cover, making a run for the nearest building. I tracked him through the scope, leading the shot, and fired. The bullet caught him in the leg, and he went down hard, his scream of pain echoing through the ruins. The others saw what had happened and hesitated, unsure of what to do. I could almost feel their fear, their uncertainty. They were trapped, and they knew it. I took out another soldier who had tried to make a break for it, the shot dropping him before he had even made it a few steps. The rest were paralyzed, too scared to move, too scared to move, too scared to stay. They were stuck in a deadly limbo, waiting for the next shot to come. And come it did. One by one, I picked them off, each shot precise and methodical. There was no rush, no urgency. I had all the time in the world, and I was going to make sure every bullet counted. When it was over, the street was silent once more. The bodies of the Soviet soldiers lay scattered in the snow, their blood mingling with the white powder. The column had been completely wiped out, their supplies abandoned in the middle of the road. I lowered my rifle, my hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving me with a strange sense of detachment. I had done what I had been trained to do, what I had done so many times before. But each time, it left me feeling a little more hollow, a little more distant from the man I had once been. I knew I should move, should find a new position before the Soviets sent reinforcements. But for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the bodies below, at the carnage I had wrought. This was the reality of the war we were fighting, a brutal, merciless conflict that cared nothing for the lives it destroyed. Finally, I forced myself to move. I packed up my rifle, checked my gear, and made my way down the stairs, each step echoing through the empty halls of the school. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending flurries of snow swirling around me as I stepped into the street. I didn't look back at the bodies as I made my way through the ruins, heading for the rendezvous point where I would meet up with the rest of my unit. There was no point. The war would claim more lives tomorrow, and the day after that. It was an endless cycle of death and destruction, one that I had become a part of. As I walked, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, to focus on the task at hand, but the faces of the men I had killed lingered in my mind, haunting me like ghosts. I knew they would follow me, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran. And as I trudged through the snow, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could keep going, how much longer I could keep killing before I lost myself completely. January 30th, 1944, the quiet before the storm. The days leading up to the end of January brought an eerie calm to the front. The constant roar of artillery had faded to distant rumbles, and the crack of rifles was rare. It was as if the battlefield itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to come. The snow, thick and undisturbed, blanketed the ruins of Leningrad, turning the shattered city into a white wasteland where only the dead dared to tread. I had taken up a new position in what was once a factory, its walls blackened by fire and its machines twisted and broken by bombs. The roof had collapsed in parts, allowing the snow to pile high in drifts inside the building. It was a miserable place, cold and damp, with the stench of burnt metal lingering in the air, but it offered a clear line of sight over a vital crossroads the Soviets were likely to use. For the past few days, I had seen little movement. A patrol here, a lone soldier there, but nothing significant. It was unsettling, this quiet. The front line was not far from here, and I knew the Soviets were massing for another push. It was only a matter of time before they struck, and when they did, it would be with the full force of their army. But for now, there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting was something I had grown accustomed to. In the life of a sniper, patience was as much a weapon as the rifle in your hands. You waited for the enemy to show themselves, for the perfect shot, for the moment when you could strike and disappear before they knew what hit them. But this waiting, this silence, was different. It felt like the calm before a storm, the ominous lull that came before the heavens opened and unleashed their fury. I spent my days in the factory, lying in the shadows, my rifle always within reach. I had cleared a small area on the second floor, where a broken window gave me a perfect view of the crossroads below. The floor was cold and hard, the remnants of shattered glass crunching beneath my boots as I moved. I tried to keep warm, but the chill seemed to seep into my bones, numbing my fingers and toes, no matter how many layers I wore. My thoughts drifted as I waited, memories surfacing from a time before the war. I remembered my home, a small village nestled in the Bavarian Alps, far removed from the horrors of the Eastern Front. I thought of my family, my parents, my sister. I hadn't heard from them in months, and I didn't know if they were even alive. The last letter I had received was from my sister, a brief note telling me that she and our parents were safe, but that supplies were running low and the winters had been harsh. I wondered if they thought of me, if they knew what I had become. A killer, a ghost in the ruins of a city that was itself dying. I wondered if they would recognize me now, this man who had been shaped by war, who had seen too much and done too much to ever be the same. The sound of crunching snow brought me back to the present. I tensed, my hand instinctively reaching for my rifle. I peered through the scope, scanning the area below. A group of Soviet soldiers had appeared, moving cautiously along the road that led to the crossroads. There were 5 of them, dressed in heavy winter coats, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were moving slowly, their breath visible in the frigid air. They were scouting, I realized, looking for weaknesses, preparing for the coming assault. I watched them for a moment, my finger hovering near the trigger. I could take them out, one by one, before they even knew where the shots were coming from, but something made me hesitate. They weren't in a combat formation. They weren't expecting a sniper, and something about the way they moved, the way they scanned their surroundings, made me think that this group was not the vanguard of an attack, but rather a reconnaissance team sent to gather information. I decided to let them pass. Shooting them now would only alert the Soviets to my presence, and I needed to stay hidden, to remain a threat they couldn't pinpoint. I watched as the soldiers disappeared into the ruins, their footsteps fading into the distance. The wind picked up, howling through the broken windows of the factory, sending a shiver down my spine. I adjusted my position, trying to find some semblance of comfort on the hard, frozen floor. My stomach growled, a reminder that I hadn't eaten in hours. I reached into my pack and pulled out a piece of bread, hard and stale, but it was all I had. I chewed slowly, the bread dry and tasteless in my mouth. As I ate, I kept my eyes on the road below, watching for any sign of movement. But the street remained empty, the snow undisturbed, as if the world had forgotten this place. The factory was silent, save for the occasional creak of the building settling under the weight of the snow. My thoughts drifted again, this time to the men I had killed. I had lost count of how many lives I had taken since the war began, but each one left a mark, a stain on my soul that I couldn't wash away. I had become numb to the act of killing, a necessity in this war, but the faces of the dead still haunted me, appearing in my dreams, accusing me with their silent eyes. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the task at hand, but in the silence they were relentless, creeping into my mind like the cold that seeped into my bones. I thought of the young Soviet soldier I had killed a few days ago, the look of surprise on his face as he fell to the ground, his life snuffed out in an instant. I wondered if he had a family, if there was someone waiting for him to come home, someone who would never know what had happened to him. The war had turned us all into monsters, killing without hesitation, without thought. We were fighting for survival, for a cause that seemed more distant with each passing day. But at what cost? How much of our humanity would be left when this was all over? I finished the bread and wiped my hands on my coat. There was no use dwelling on these thoughts. The war would not wait for me to sort out my feelings. I had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. The day passed slowly, the sun barely rising above the horizon before sinking back into darkness. The temperature dropped even further as night fell, the cold biting at my face, my fingers numb despite the gloves I wore. I wrapped myself in my coat, trying to stay warm, but it was a losing battle. I knew I should sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. Not here, not now. The Soviets could attack at any moment, and I needed to be ready. So I stayed awake, watching the road, listening to the sounds of the city, waiting for the storm that I knew was coming. The hours dragged on, the silence becoming oppressive. I found myself thinking again of home, of the mountains, the snow that had once been a source of joy, now a reminder of the war that had taken everything from me. I thought of my sister, her laughter, the way she would scold me for being too serious, too focused on my studies. I wondered if she was still alive, if she had managed to survive the winter, the bombings, the hunger. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this, living in the shadows, hiding from the enemy, from my own thoughts. The war was wearing me down, grinding away at my resolve, my will to fight. But what choice did I have? There was no going back, no escaping this nightmare. As dawn approached, I forced myself to stand, to stretch my stiff limbs. The cold was unbearable, but I had to move, had to stay sharp. The Soviets would come soon, and when they did, I needed to be ready. I looked out over the road, the snow glistening in the pale light of the early morning. The quiet was unsettling, a calm that I knew wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and when it hit, it would bring death and destruction in its wake. I took a deep breath, the air freezing in my lungs. I was ready. I had to be. The war wasn't over yet, and neither was I. February 2nd, 1944, the battle begins. The storm that I had feared finally arrived, not in the form of snow, but in the relentless advance of the Soviet forces. On the morning of February 2nd, 1944, the quiet that had hung over the front lines was shattered by the roar of artillery, the earth trembling as shells rained down on our positions. The air was filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the sharp, deafening blasts of explosions, and the distant shouts of men preparing for battle. From my vantage point in the ruined factory, I could see the Soviet troops moving forward, their lines stretching as far as the eye could see. They moved with grim determination, their breath steaming in the cold air as they advanced through the snow, weapons at the ready. It was a massive offensive, the kind of overwhelming force that had broken many German lines before. And now it was bearing down on us. I tightened my grip on my rifle, feeling the familiar weight in my hands. The Soviets were within range, and it was time to do what I had trained for. I scanned the advancing troops through my scope, searching for officers, for anyone who looked like they were giving orders. In a battle like this, taking out the leaders could sow chaos, slow their advance, and give our men a fighting chance. My breathing slowed as I focused, the noise of the battle fading into the background. There a lieutenant, shouting orders to the men around him, gesturing with his arm as he directed their movement. I adjusted my aim, centering the crosshairs on his chest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, and the lieutenant went down, the red spray of blood stark against the snow. His men hesitated, confused, but only for a moment. The sheer momentum of their advance pushed them forward, the gap quickly filled by another officer. I moved on to my next target, a machine gunner setting up his weapon on a small rise, preparing to unleash a deadly hail of bullets on our men. I could see his hands moving swiftly, setting up the tripod, loading the belt of ammunition. He was calm, methodical, experienced. I couldn't let him finish. I fired, and the bullet struck him in the side, knocking him off balance. He fell forward, clutching his wound, and the machine gun was left unmanned, its potential for destruction neutralized for the moment. The Soviets kept coming, wave after wave, their numbers seemingly endless. For every man I killed, 10 more appeared to take his place. I fired again and again, each shot carefully placed, each target chosen for maximum effect. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with a single sandbag. The German lines were holding, but only just. I could see our soldiers scrambling to reinforce their positions, ducking behind whatever cover they could find as the Soviet artillery pounded the earth around them. The ground shook with each explosion, sending up clouds of snow and dirt, turning the once white landscape into a nightmarish scene of mud and blood. The cold was brutal, the wind biting through my coat, but I barely noticed it now. The adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me focused, kept me moving. I reloaded my rifle, the motion automatic, and lined up my next shot. The Soviet troops had reached the crossroads now, the place I had been watching for days. They were trying to push through, to break our line and split our forces. I saw a group of them taking cover behind a half-destroyed wall, preparing to make a dash for the next piece of cover. I fired at the first man who stood, dropping him before he had taken more than a step. The others hesitated, realizing they were exposed, but the officer with them barked an order, and they moved anyway, fear of their superiors outweighing the fear of death. I took aim at the officer, my breath steady, and fired. The bullet struck him just below the collarbone, and he went down, clutching at his wound as his men scattered, unsure of what to do without his guidance. But they didn't retreat. The Soviets rarely did. Instead, they hunkered down, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover, returning fire with their rifles and submachine guns. The sound of bullets whizzing past my position was a constant reminder of the danger, the sharp cracks and pings as they struck the walls of the factory or the metal beams overhead. I pulled back slightly, adjusting my position, knowing that staying in one place too long could be a death sentence. A sniper had to be mobile, unpredictable. I had learned that lesson early in the war, and it had kept me alive so far. As I moved to a new firing position, I heard a shout from below. I peered out through a gap in the wall and saw a small group of German soldiers pinned down in the street, their faces pale with fear as they tried to avoid the hail of bullets coming from a nearby building. The Soviets had set up a machine gun in one of the upper floors, and it was tearing our men apart. I knew what I had to do. I crawled to the edge of the floor, where I had a clear view of the building across the street. The machine gunner was hidden behind a window, only the barrel of his weapon visible as it spat death at my comrades. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and lined up the shot. The distance was greater than I usually preferred, and the angle was difficult, but I couldn't afford to miss. I adjusted for the wind, the drop of the bullet over the distance, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, cutting through the noise of the battle. I watched as the machine gun abruptly stopped firing, the gunner slumping over the weapon, his head a ruined mess. The German soldiers below saw their chance and charged forward, taking the building in a matter of moments. But there was no time to savor the victory. The battle was far from over. The Soviets were still advancing, Their numbers overwhelming, their resolve unshakable. I returned to my position, scanning the battlefield for my next target. Hours passed, the battle raging with no end in sight. The sky darkened, the sun hidden behind thick clouds, and still the Soviets pressed on. My hands were shaking from the cold and exhaustion, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them break through. As the day wore on, the sounds of battle began to fade. The Soviet advance had slowed, their attacks becoming less frequent, less organized. The ground between our lines and theirs was littered with bodies, the snow stained red with blood. It was clear that they had taken heavy losses, but so had we. The price of holding the line had been steep, and as I looked out over the battlefield, I couldn't help but wonder if it had been worth it. The Soviets were pulling back now, retreating to regroup, to prepare for the next assault. The artillery fire had ceased, and the only sounds were the distant cries of the wounded and the occasional crack of a rifle. I lowered my rifle, my body aching with fatigue. The adrenaline that had kept me going was gone, leaving me feeling hollow, drained. I knew the battle wasn't over, that the Soviets would return, but for now there was a brief respite, a moment to catch my breath. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and forced myself to stand. My legs were stiff, my muscles sore from hours of lying in the same position. I needed to move, to find a new place to set up before the next attack came. But as I looked out over the battlefield, at the bodies lying in the snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. This wasn't just another battle, another day on the front. It felt like the beginning of the end, like the storm that had been brewing for so long had finally broken. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. There would be time to think, to reflect, later. For now, I had to prepare for the next wave, for the next onslaught. The war wasn't over, and neither was I. With a final glance at the battlefield, I turned and made my way down the stairs, my rifle slung over my shoulder. The factory was quiet now, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the snow-covered floor. I knew the Soviets would be back, and when they came, I would be ready. But as I stepped out into the cold, into the gathering darkness, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could keep going, how much longer I could fight before the storm finally swept me away. February 5th, 1944, the winter's grip. 3 days had passed since the Soviet offensive began, and the front was in a state of uneasy tension. The initial shock of the attack had worn off, but the damage had been done. Our lines were frayed, barely holding together under the relentless pressure. The once orderly defense had turned into a desperate struggle for survival, with each man fighting not just for the Reich, but for his life. The cold had grown worse, the temperature plunging well below freezing. The snow was no longer a soft, powdery blanket, but a hard, icy crust that crunched underfoot. The wind cut through even the thickest coats, chilling us to the bone. It was as if the winter itself had joined the Soviets in their assault. A silent, unyielding enemy that sapped our strength and wore us down. I had relocated to a new position, deeper within the ruins of the city. The factory had served me well, but its exposed location made it too dangerous to remain there. My new hide was in the upper floor of what had once been a department store, now a hollow shell of its former self. The roof had caved in, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, but it offered a clear view of the street below, and more importantly, it provided cover. The days were a blur of gray skies and falling snow, the nights long and sleepless. The Soviets had resumed their attacks, probing our defenses with small skirmishes, testing our resolve. They were looking for weaknesses, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they found one. I had settled into a routine, my life reduced to a cycle of watching, waiting, and killing. The silence between battles was oppressive, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your sanity. In those quiet moments, the mind wandered, dredging up memories and doubts that had no place on the battlefield. I kept them at bay by focusing on the task at hand. Every day, I scouted the area, noting the positions of the enemy, their movements, their patterns. I could see the weariness in their faces, the same exhaustion that plagued our own troops. but they kept coming, driven by some force I couldn't understand. Was it duty? Fear? Hatred? Perhaps all three. On the morning of February 5th, I awoke to the distant rumble of artillery. The ground trembled beneath me as I lay in my makeshift bed, a thin mattress I had scavenged from a nearby building. The walls of the store creaked and groaned, but they held, the thick stone offering some protection from the bombardment. I rose slowly, every muscle in my body protesting the movement. My joints were stiff from the cold, my fingers numb, despite the gloves I wore. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. Breakfast was a meager affair, a piece of stale bread and a few sips of water from my canteen. I ate quickly, not wanting to risk frostbite by exposing my hands for too long. The food was tasteless, but it was fuel, and that was all that mattered. Once I had eaten, I retrieved my rifle from its hiding place beneath a pile of rubble. The metal was cold to the touch, and I spent several minutes checking it over, making sure everything was in working order. In this weather, a jammed bolt or a frozen trigger could be a death sentence. When I was satisfied that the rifle was ready, I moved to my position at the broken window. The glass had long since been shattered, leaving jagged edges that I had carefully cleared away to avoid cutting myself. I settled in, adjusting my scope to account for the poor visibility. The sky was overcast, thick clouds hanging low, promising more snow before the day was out. The street below was quiet, but I knew that could change in an instant. I had seen it before the sudden eruption of gunfire, the flash of movement as soldiers appeared seemingly out of nowhere. It was a lesson I had learned early: never let your guard down, not even for a second. Hours passed as I lay there, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of the enemy. My breath was visible in the cold air, each exhale a small cloud that quickly dissipated. The only sounds were the distant echoes of artillery and the occasional creak of the building as it settled. And then, just as I was beginning to think the day would pass without incident, I saw them. A small group of Soviet soldiers, moving cautiously along the street. They were spaced out, keeping low, their eyes darting around as they advanced. They were moving with purpose, not the hesitant steps of a patrol, but the determined march of men on a mission. I counted 5 of them, all heavily armed. They were heading toward one of our defensive positions, a makeshift bunker set up in the ruins of a nearby building. If they reached it undetected, they could cause serious damage, perhaps even break through our line. I couldn't let that happen. I shifted slightly, bringing the first soldier into my sights. He was in the lead, a sergeant by the look of his uniform. He moved with confidence, his rifle at the ready, his breath steaming in the cold air. I lined up the shot, taking into account the wind and the distance. My finger hovered over the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. It came when he paused to signal to his men. For a split second he was still, his hand raised in the air. I squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out, cutting through the silence. The sergeant jerked back, a red stain blossoming on his chest as he crumpled to the ground. The other soldiers reacted instantly, diving for cover behind the rubble, but they didn't know where the shot had come from, and that gave me the advantage. I quickly found my next target, a young soldier who was trying to drag the sergeant's body to safety. His face was a mask of terror, his hands trembling as he grabbed the dead man's coat. I fired again, and the young soldier fell, blood pooling beneath him as he lay motionless in the snow. The remaining 3 were pinned down now, their plan in disarray. I could see them talking, shouting over the noise of the battle, trying to decide what to do. But they were outmatched. I picked them off one by one, each shot precise, each target falling before they could even see where I was. It was over in less than a minute, the street once again silent, the bodies of the Soviet soldiers lying still in the snow. I stayed in position, watching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The enemy had been dealt with, for now at least. I knew they would send more, they always did, but for the moment the line held. I lowered my rifle, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The adrenaline slowly drained from my system, leaving me feeling exhausted, more tired than I had been in days. Killing had become almost mechanical, a necessary task in this brutal war. But it was never easy, not really. Each life I took weighed on me, a burden I carried in silence. I forced myself to move, to check the area around me, making sure I wasn't exposed. Satisfied that I was still hidden, I allowed myself a brief moment of rest. I leaned back against the wall, my eyes closed, the cold seeping through my coat and into my skin. The faces of the men I had just killed flashed in my mind. They were so young, so full of life. I wondered if they had families waiting for them, if they had dreams beyond this war. But those thoughts were dangerous, a path I couldn't afford to go down. In this war, compassion could get you killed. I opened my eyes, pushing the thoughts away. There was no room for doubt, no space for regret. I was a soldier, a sniper, and my duty was clear. The war had no place for hesitation or mercy. The day dragged on, the sky growing darker as the afternoon wore on. The snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, covering the bodies in the street, erasing the signs of battle. It was as if the winter itself was trying to hide the horrors of the war, to bury them beneath a blanket of white. But I knew better. The snow couldn't hide the truth. It couldn't erase the blood that had been spilled, the lives that had been lost. The war would go on, and I would continue to fight, to survive, for as long as I could. As night fell, I prepared to move to a new position, knowing that staying in one place too long was too dangerous. I packed up my rifle, my few supplies, and carefully made my way down the stairs, each step deliberate, cautious. The streets were empty as I emerged from the building, the snow muffling my footsteps. The cold was biting, the wind howling through the ruins, but I pressed on, heading toward a new vantage point I had scouted earlier. As I walked, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer this war would last, how much more blood would be spilled before it was over. But those were questions for another time, for men far removed from the front lines. For me, there was only the next day, the next battle, the next shot. And so I kept walking, into the cold, into the night, the war all around me, unending. February 8th, 1944 shadows in the snow. The days had blended into one long, cold blur. I had lost track of time, each hour marked only by the passage of light to dark, then back to light again. The world had shrunk to the size of my scope, the war reduced to a series of fleeting images, a flash of movement, the crosshairs aligning, the trigger squeezed, the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. There was no room for anything else, not in this frozen hell. February 8th dawned much like the days before it, with the pale light of the winter sun struggling to break through the thick clouds that hung low over the battlefield. The snow had not stopped falling for days, the white blanket growing deeper, smothering the sounds of war, muffling the distant rumble of artillery and the crack of gunfire. The world was silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. I had moved my position once again, this time to the remains of an old schoolhouse on the outskirts of the city. The building was in worse shape than most. Its roof had collapsed, and its walls were riddled with holes, but it offered a clear view of a stretch of road the Soviets had been using to move supplies and troops. It was a good spot, isolated and well covered, perfect for picking off targets without being seen. The snow was my ally now, covering me as I lay prone in the rubble, my rifle nestled against my shoulder, my breath barely visible in the freezing air. I had set up my scope, adjusting it to account for the snowfall, the wind, the distance. It was a constant dance of calculations, each shot requiring precision, patience, and a steady hand. Hours passed in silence. My eyes scanned the road, looking for the telltale signs of movement. The Soviets were cautious, more so than they had been a few days ago. They had learned to fear the unseen sniper, the ghost in the snow who could strike without warning, without mercy. The sun was beginning its slow descent When I finally saw them, 4 figures moving slowly along the road, their shapes blurred by the falling snow. They were spread out, moving cautiously, their heads on a swivel as they scanned the ruins for any sign of danger. It was a small patrol, likely sent to scout the area or to probe our defenses. I watched them through my scope, my breathing steady, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. I could see the tension in their movements, the fear in their eyes as they glanced around, knowing they were exposed, vulnerable. They were right to be afraid. I focused on the lead soldier, a young man barely out of his teens. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, the winter and the war having taken their toll. He moved with the weary determination of someone who had seen too much, but still had a job to do. I lined up the shot, my mind going through the familiar routine: check the wind, adjust for distance, wait for the right moment. And then, something made me hesitate. It was a split-second decision, a flicker of doubt that I couldn't explain. I lowered my rifle slightly, just enough to take in the full scene before me. The soldiers were moving closer, the lead man now within range, but still, I didn't pull the trigger. What was I waiting for? I had taken this shot 100 times before, never hesitating, never faltering. But now, as I watched this young man struggle through the snow, something inside me recoiled. He was just a boy, barely older than I had been when this war started. He was just like me, another pawn in this endless, senseless slaughter. The moment passed, and I forced myself to focus. Hesitation was a luxury I couldn't afford. I realigned my sights, centering the crosshairs on the soldier's chest. But just as I was about to fire, something caught my eye movement to my right, a flicker of shadow against the white. I shifted my aim just in time to see another figure, moving through the ruins parallel to the road. He was trying to be stealthy, but the snow betrayed him, his dark uniform standing out against the white. He was flanking the patrol, moving quickly, his rifle at the ready. But he wasn't Soviet, he was one of ours, a German soldier. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary patrol. This was a trap, a ruse to lure out snipers like me. The Soviets had sent their men down the road, knowing that snipers would be watching, waiting to pick them off. And then, as soon as we revealed our positions, their own marksmen would strike. I cursed under my breath, quickly adjusting my scope. The German soldier was closing in on the lead Soviet, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. He hadn't seen me, hadn't realized I was in position to cover him. I had a split second to make a choice: take out the Soviets, or protect my comrade. The decision was made for me when the Soviet patrol suddenly stopped. The lead soldier had spotted something, a flash of movement, a noise, perhaps just a sixth sense honed by months of combat. He raised his hand, signaling his men to spread out, to find cover. The German soldier froze, realizing too late that he had been spotted. The Soviets were fast, diving behind the cover of a collapsed wall, their rifles swinging around to target the German. He was exposed, out in the open, with nowhere to run. I didn't hesitate this time. I aimed quickly, my scope zeroing in on the nearest Soviet soldier. I squeezed the trigger, the shot ringing out, echoing off the ruins. The bullet found its mark, hitting the Soviet in the side, dropping him instantly. The other Soviets reacted with practiced efficiency, returning fire even as they scrambled for better cover. But they were at a disadvantage, pinned down by the flanking German and unable to locate my position. I took another shot, this one catching a soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around before he collapsed into the snow. The German soldier took advantage of the chaos, rushing forward and firing as he went. His bullets found their targets, 2 more Soviets falling before they even knew what hit them. The fight was over in seconds, the bodies lying still in the snow, their blood staining the white ground red. The German lowered his rifle, breathing heavily, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked around, searching for any remaining threats, before finally spotting me. I was still in my position, my rifle trained on the area, ready for any surprises. He raised a hand in a gesture of thanks, but I didn't respond. I simply watched him, my mind racing. This was the closest I had come to death in weeks, and it had been because of a hesitation, a moment of doubt. It was a reminder of how quickly things could change, how easily one mistake could cost you everything. The German turned and started to move back toward our lines, leaving the bodies of the Soviets where they had fallen. I stayed in my position, watching until he disappeared into the ruins. Only then did I allow myself to relax, lowering my rifle and leaning back against the cold stone wall. The snow began to fall again, covering the bodies, erasing the signs of battle. But I knew the truth. The war was far from over, and every day was a fight for survival. There was no room for doubt, no place for hesitation. Not if I wanted to live to see another day. As I sat there, the cold seeping into my bones, I couldn't shake the image of the young Soviet soldier, his eyes wide with fear as he moved through the snow. He had been just like me, caught in this terrible, endless war, fighting for a cause he might not even believe in. But I couldn't dwell on that. I couldn't afford to. The war would go on, and I would keep fighting, keep surviving, for as long as I could. There was no other choice. February 11th, 1944, The Devil's Gambit. The days in the frozen landscape of the Eastern Front seemed to stretch endlessly. Each morning greeted me with the same bleak expanse of white, the same biting cold that gnawed at my resolve. But February 11th brought with it a grim promise a new offensive was underway, and the air was charged with a palpable tension. It was as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for the clash of steel and the roar of gunfire. I had moved once again, this time to the remains of an old warehouse on the outskirts of a ravaged industrial district. The warehouse was a skeleton of its former self, its walls crumbling and its windows shattered. But it had a certain strategic advantage, a clear view of a railway line that the Soviets had been using to transport supplies. From my vantage point, I could see everything that passed along that crucial supply route. The morning was overcast, the sky a uniform gray, blending seamlessly with the snow-covered ground. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold penetrating my bones despite the layers of clothing I wore. I adjusted my coat and settled into position, my breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. I had learned to appreciate the relative silence that accompanied the snowfall. It muffled the sounds of distant artillery and the occasional bursts of gunfire, creating a deceptive calm. It was during these moments that I felt the weight of the war most acutely, the endless waiting, the unending vigilance. It was easy to lose oneself in the cold and the quiet, to forget the world outside the scope. Today, however, was different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The Soviets had been unusually quiet for the past few days, their usual probing attacks and skirmishes conspicuously absent. It was a troubling silence, one that suggested they were preparing for something bigger. I watched the railway line intently, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. It was mid-morning when I first saw a convoy of Soviet trucks, heavily loaded, making its way slowly along the tracks. The convoy was escorted by a small contingent of soldiers, their rifles at the ready as they moved alongside the vehicles. My heart quickened as I assessed the situation. This was an opportunity, a chance to disrupt their supply lines and cause some real damage. But I knew it was also a dangerous gamble. The convoy was heavily guarded, and any attempt to engage would likely draw the attention of Soviet snipers and machine gunners. I adjusted my scope, lining up the first shot. The convoy was moving steadily, the trucks rolling along the tracks with an almost mechanical precision. The soldiers walked alongside, their heads swiveling, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area. They were well trained, aware of the dangers, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. I chose my target carefully, a soldier near the rear of the convoy, a young man with a distinctive red armband marking him as an officer. He was issuing orders, gesturing with a clipboard, his back turned to me. It was the perfect opportunity. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands as I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the warehouse, the bullet finding its mark with a sickening thud. The officer dropped instantly, his clipboard falling from his hand, his body crumpling to the ground. The convoy erupted into chaos, the soldiers shouting and diving for cover, their rifles swinging wildly. I quickly shifted my aim, targeting another soldier who was trying to drag the officer's body out of the line of fire. He fell with a single shot, his screams piercing the stillness of the snow-covered landscape. The convoy was now in disarray. The trucks halted, the soldiers scattered, their formation broken. I took another shot, picking off a soldier who was trying to take cover behind one of the trucks. The convoy was under attack, but the Soviets were reacting with discipline. They returned fire, their bullets whizzing past my position, forcing me to keep my head down. The chaos below was palpable. The Soviet soldiers were moving frantically, their attempts to reorganize stymied by the sudden onslaught. I continued to fire, my shots precise, each one finding its target. The convoy was being torn apart, the trucks immobilized, the soldiers falling one by one. But the Soviets weren't going to take this lying down. I saw movement on the edge of the railway line, a group of Soviet snipers, their rifles glinting in the pale light. They had been positioned as a countermeasure, likely anticipating a sniper attack. They began to return fire, their bullets slamming into the building around me, chipping away at the walls, creating dangerous cracks in the structure. I shifted my position, moving carefully to avoid the incoming fire. The warehouse offered limited cover, and I could feel the walls vibrating with each impact. The Soviet snipers were skilled, their shots accurate, and they were closing in on my location. I had to act quickly. I repositioned to a more secure part of the warehouse, setting up my rifle once again. I focused on the Soviet snipers, identifying their locations through the scope. I could see them moving among the ruins, their faces determined, their rifles trained on my general area. The return fire was intense, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the metal and stone around me almost deafening. I held my breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Soviet snipers were methodical, working in pairs, covering each other's movements. It was a deadly dance, one that required both skill and luck. I took a deep breath and fired, targeting the closest Soviet sniper. The shot was true, and the enemy sniper fell, his body collapsing into the snow. I quickly moved on to the next target, the adrenaline sharpening my focus, my aim steady despite the danger. The fight continued, the warehouse a battleground of snow and gunfire. The Soviet snipers were relentless, but I was determined. Each shot was carefully calculated, each target taken out with precision. The convoy was now a wreck, the Soviet soldiers scattered, their morale shattered. As the last Soviet sniper fell, the remaining soldiers began to retreat, their formation collapsing under the pressure. The convoy had been effectively neutralized, the supply line disrupted. It was a significant victory, but it had come at a cost. I surveyed the scene through my scope, watching as the Soviets withdrew, their vehicles abandoned, their dead and wounded left behind. The snow continued to fall, covering the carnage, erasing the traces of the battle. It was a temporary victory, a fleeting moment of success in an ongoing war. I took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from my body. The fight was over, for now. I carefully packed up my rifle, making sure to secure all my equipment. The warehouse was no longer safe. The Soviets would send reinforcements, and I needed to move before they discovered my location. I emerged from the warehouse, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the cold biting at my exposed skin. The world was a vast expanse of white, the aftermath of the battle barely visible beneath the fresh layer of snow. The silence was both eerie and comforting, a reminder of the price of victory. As I made my way through the snow-covered ruins, I couldn't help but reflect on the nature of the conflict. It was a brutal, unforgiving struggle, one that demanded sacrifice and resolve. But it was also a reminder of the human cost of war, the lives lost, the families shattered. The Soviets had been dealt a blow, but the war was far from over. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, and more moments of fleeting triumph. For now, all I could do was keep moving, keep surviving, and hope that the next battle would bring us closer to the end of this brutal conflict. As night fell, I found a new position, a small abandoned house on the edge of the ruins. It was cold and drafty, but it offered some shelter from the harsh winter winds. I settled in, my mind racing with the events of the day. The battle had been intense, but it was a stark reminder of the price we were all paying for survival. I closed my eyes, the sounds of the war fading into the background, the cold a constant presence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of rest, the war continuing its relentless march forward, the snow-covered landscape a silent witness to the endless struggle. February 15th, 1944, the echoes of betrayal. The morning of February 15th arrived with a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. The sun struggled to pierce through the dense layer of clouds, casting a dim, grey pallor over the snow-covered battlefield. I had taken refuge in a small, dilapidated farmhouse near the edge of the town, its once sturdy walls now crumbling under the weight of war and weather. The farmhouse offered little in the way of comfort, but it was strategically positioned, giving me a commanding view of the surrounding area. From my vantage point, I could see the remnants of the Soviet offensive burned-out vehicles, scattered debris, and the occasional patrol moving cautiously through the ruins. The front lines had stabilized for the moment, but the sense of impending conflict was palpable. I had spent the night in a fitful sleep, the echoes of yesterday's battle still fresh in my mind. The snow had covered the remains of the convoy, but the memory of the fight was clear and vivid. The Soviets had been pushed back, but they would regroup and return, as relentless as the winter itself. As I prepared for the day, I reviewed my equipment with meticulous care. My rifle was disassembled and cleaned, each part inspected for wear and damage. The snow was relentless, and keeping my gear in top condition was crucial for maintaining accuracy and reliability. I double-checked my ammunition and made sure that my position was secure, ready for whatever the day might bring. The farmhouse had a small attic, which I had converted into a makeshift observation post. It provided a good view of the surrounding area, but it was also a precarious vantage point. The walls were thin and the roof leaked, but it was the best I could manage under the circumstances. I settled into position, my rifle at the ready, my eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of activity. Hours passed in tense anticipation. The quiet was oppressive, the only sounds the distant crackle of artillery and the howling wind. The Soviets were conspicuously absent, and the lull in activity felt almost unnatural. It was as if the calm before a storm, a deceptive stillness that hinted at something much more dangerous. Around midday, my patience was rewarded. I spotted movement in the distance, 3 Soviet soldiers emerging from a cluster of ruins. They moved cautiously, their rifles held at the ready as they navigated through the wreckage. Their body language suggested they were on high alert, scanning their surroundings with nervous eyes. I trained my scope on the lead soldier, a burly man with a thick mustache and a fur-lined hat. He was clearly in charge, issuing terse orders to his subordinates. They were making their way toward a partially collapsed building, which, from my perspective, seemed to serve as a makeshift command post. It was a critical position, likely holding valuable intelligence or coordinating supplies. I took a deep breath, focusing on the soldiers' movements. The air was still, the only sound the rhythmic thump of my heart as I prepared to take the shot. But just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, I saw something that made me hesitate. A flash of movement behind the Soviets, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a German soldier, his uniform a stark contrast against the snow. He moved swiftly, his rifle slung across his back, his face hidden by a balaclava. He was flanking the Soviets, moving with a deliberate, practiced stealth. I watched as he crept closer, his intent clear. He was aiming to ambush the Soviets, catching them off guard. The sight was both a relief and a concern. On one hand, the presence of a fellow German soldier indicated that we were not alone in this desolate place. On the other, It raised questions about our position and the possibility of internal conflict. The Soviet soldiers were in danger, but so was this German soldier, caught in a dangerous game of deception and betrayal. I kept my rifle trained on the Soviet leader, my mind racing. The German soldier was now within range, his movements precise, his focus on the Soviets. He took up a concealed position behind a crumbling wall, preparing to strike. I could see the determination in his eyes, the resolve to complete his mission. But something wasn't right. The soldier's actions were too calculated, too deliberate. He was moving with the efficiency of a seasoned operative, but there was an underlying tension, a hint of desperation. It was as if he was trying to cover up something more sinister. I decided to wait, to see how the situation would unfold. My breath fogged up the scope as I continued to monitor both the Soviet patrol and the German soldier. The tension was almost unbearable, the silence punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind. The German soldier waited until the Soviets were close to the building before opening fire. His shots were precise, the first Soviet soldier collapsing with a muffled cry. The remaining 2 Soviets scrambled for cover, their rifles firing wildly in response. The German soldier moved quickly, his aim deadly, his shots finding their marks. The ambush was successful, the Soviet patrol neutralized within moments. But as the smoke cleared and the bodies lay strewn in the snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The German soldier approached the fallen Soviets, examining their belongings with a cold, detached efficiency. I watched in growing unease as the soldier began to search through the Soviet soldier's gear. He pulled out documents, maps, and other items of interest, his movements meticulous. But there was something else hidden beneath a pile of rubble. He uncovered a large box, its contents obscured. Curiosity got the better of me, and I adjusted my scope to get a better view. The box was filled with letters, photographs, and what looked like personal effects. The soldier carefully examined each item, his expression growing more intense. It was clear that he was searching for something specific, something of great importance. Then, to my shock, the German soldier retrieved a small vial from one of the pockets of the dead Soviet officers. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with a look of grim satisfaction. It was a vial of poison, a weapon of last resort, something that could change the course of the conflict in ways I could barely imagine. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The German soldier wasn't just performing a routine ambush. He was after something far more critical, a piece of intelligence that could influence the outcome of the war. The Soviets had been carrying information, and this soldier was sent to retrieve it, no matter the cost. The situation was more complicated than I had anticipated. I needed to report what I had witnessed, but the means of communication were limited. I had no way of knowing whether the German soldier was acting on orders from high command, or if he was pursuing a personal vendetta. Either way, the implications were troubling. As the German soldier departed, leaving the battlefield and heading back to our lines, I felt a deep sense of unease. The snow-covered ground now bore the marks of betrayal and deception, and the lines between friend and foe had become blurred. The war was no longer just about fighting the enemy, it was about navigating a web of intrigue and treachery. I packed up my gear, leaving the farmhouse behind. The next few days promised to be even more dangerous, with the Soviets likely to regroup and respond to the disruption. I had to stay vigilant, prepared for anything. The echoes of betrayal would reverberate through the battlefield, and I would need to be ready for whatever came next. The snow began to fall again, covering the signs of the recent battle, erasing the evidence of the confrontation. It was a cold, harsh reminder of the cost of war and the complexities that lay beneath the surface. As I made my way through the frozen landscape, I knew that the days ahead would be filled with uncertainty and danger. February 20th, 1944, the thin line of survival. The morning of February 20th dawned with a deceptive tranquility. The sky, a muted grey, hung heavy with the promise of more snow, and the wind howled relentlessly through the desolate ruins of the Eastern Front. I had taken up a new position in a half-collapsed factory, its skeletal remains offering some degree of shelter from the bitter cold. The factory's walls were scarred by countless shells and bullets, but it provided a vantage point that was crucial for observing the area. The factory's interior was a maze of broken machinery and twisted metal, remnants of a once bustling industrial operation now reduced to a battlefield relic. I had fortified my position within an old office, the walls and floor strewn with debris, but still offering a view through a cracked window. From here, I could see the Soviet supply lines and anticipate their movements. I had spent the previous day gathering intelligence on Soviet troop movements and the layout of their fortifications. The Soviet forces had been relatively quiet, their main activity confined to small skirmishes and defensive measures. But the calm was deceptive. The Soviets were preparing for a significant push, and I could sense the tension in the air. As I settled into my position, I reviewed the maps and documents I had managed to salvage. They revealed a series of Soviet strongpoints and supply depots scattered across the region. The information was invaluable, but it also painted a grim picture of the Soviet strategic intentions. They were not merely defending, they were planning an offensive that could shift the balance of power on the Eastern Front. The factory was cold, the temperature dropping even further as the day progressed. I wrapped myself in an extra layer of clothing, trying to stave off the chill that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. The cold was relentless, a constant reminder of the harsh conditions we faced daily. Mid-morning brought a flurry of activity. I spotted a Soviet patrol moving through the ruins, their breath visible in the freezing air. They were making their way toward a nearby supply depot, unaware of the precarious nature of their situation. I watched them closely, noting their numbers and equipment. They were heavily armed, their rifles and machine guns indicating a readiness for combat. I carefully positioned my rifle, aligning it with the window's edge. The patrol was moving slowly, their footsteps muffled by the snow, their movements cautious. They were on high alert, scanning their surroundings with practiced vigilance. I took a deep breath, steadying my aim. As I prepared to take the shot, I heard a faint sound, footsteps approaching from behind. I turned cautiously, my heart pounding. Through the narrow gaps in the factory's walls, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a German soldier, his uniform barely visible against the backdrop of rubble and snow. The soldier moved with purpose, his face hidden by a balaclava. He was carrying a large bag, his movements deliberate and focused. I recognized him from earlier encounters. He was part of a unit specializing in reconnaissance and sabotage. He had been seen around the area, but his presence now was unexpected. I decided to wait and observe. The German soldier approached the Soviet patrol, positioning himself behind a stack of crates. He began to set up a small, makeshift explosive device, his hands working quickly and efficiently. It was a sign that he intended to disrupt the Soviet supply line, a dangerous but potentially effective tactic. I was torn between continuing my observation of the patrol and monitoring the German soldier. The situation was volatile, and any misstep could lead to disaster. I decided to keep an eye on both, ready to react if necessary. The German soldier completed his work and retreated to a safe distance. He signaled to me with a hand gesture, a silent indication that he was finished and that I should expect an explosion soon. I nodded in acknowledgement, my focus shifting back to the Soviet patrol. The patrol was approaching the supply depot, their movements unhurried. They seemed unaware of the imminent threat. I adjusted my rifle, preparing for the moment when the patrol would be caught in the blast. The tension was almost unbearable, the cold adding to the sense of urgency. The explosion came suddenly, a deafening roar that shattered the silence and sent shockwaves through the factory. The Soviet patrol was caught in the blast, their bodies thrown into the air, their cries drowned out by the explosion. Smoke and debris filled the air, obscuring the view and creating a chaotic scene of destruction. I quickly took advantage of the confusion. With the patrol disoriented and their positions compromised, I took aim at the survivors, picking them off with precise shots. The remaining Soviet soldiers were scrambling for cover, their attempts to regroup thwarted by the intensity of the attack. The factory was now a scene of chaos, the sounds of gunfire and explosions reverberating through the ruins. The Soviet patrol had been decimated, their supply line disrupted, but the cost of the operation was evident. The German soldiers' explosive device had been effective, but it had also drawn considerable attention. The aftermath of the attack was a grim sight. The snow was stained with blood, the bodies of Soviet soldiers scattered among the debris. The factory's interior was filled with the remnants of the explosion, the machinery and walls damaged beyond repair. The German soldier reappeared, his face set in a grim expression. He had completed his mission, but the cost was high. We exchanged brief nods of acknowledgement before he disappeared back into the shadows. I continued to survey the scene, making sure there were no remaining threats. The Soviet response was likely to be swift and brutal, and we needed to be prepared for the inevitable counterattack. As I packed up my gear and prepared to move to a new location, I couldn't help but reflect on the nature of the conflict. The war was a brutal, unrelenting struggle, a test of endurance and resolve. Each day brought new challenges, new dangers, and new decisions that could alter the course of events. The Soviet forces would not take the attack lightly. They would regroup, reinforce their positions, and retaliate with increased ferocity. The thin line of survival was growing even thinner, and every action carried the risk of escalating the conflict further. The snow began to fall once more, covering the signs of the recent battle, erasing the evidence of the carnage. It was a cold, unforgiving landscape, a reminder of the harsh reality we faced. As I made my way through the ruins, I knew that the days ahead would be filled with uncertainty and danger. I settled into a new position, a small bunker hidden among the wreckage. It offered some protection from the elements and a vantage point for observing the Soviet movements. The cold was relentless, the conditions harsh, but I was determined to persevere. The battle was far from over, and the war would continue to test our limits. Each day was a struggle for survival, a fight against the elements and the enemy. But as long as I remained vigilant and resourceful, there was hope that we could endure the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. February 25th, 1944, the lurking shadow. The winter of 1944 clung to the Eastern Front with an unforgiving grip. By February 25th, the landscape had become a frozen wasteland, each day blending into the next under a shroud of snow and ice. My new position, a concealed outpost in the skeletal remains of a brick factory, offered limited comfort but strategic advantage. From here, I could observe the shifting dynamics of the front lines while remaining relatively protected from the elements and enemy fire. The factory's interior was a maze of shadows and cold, the remnants of industrial machinery casting ghostly silhouettes against the walls. I had reinforced my position with whatever materials I could scavenge: wooden planks, old crates, and pieces of metal. It wasn't much, but it was enough to provide a degree of camouflage and concealment. As I settled into my makeshift nest, the cold seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing, seeping through to my bones. The factory's old windows, now shattered and rimmed with frost, provided a view of the surrounding terrain, a mix of ruined buildings, twisted metal, and patches of snow. The silence was profound, occasionally broken by the distant crackle of gunfire or the low rumble of artillery. I spent the morning adjusting my equipment, ensuring that my rifle was in perfect working order. The harsh conditions had taken a toll, and maintaining my gear was essential for both accuracy and survival. I inspected my scope, cleaned my barrel, and checked my ammunition, each action a testament to the meticulousness required for my role. The day's primary task was to gather intelligence on Soviet movements. Reports from our command indicated that the Soviets were planning a significant offensive, and it was crucial to understand their strategies and positions. I had already noted several key locations and troop concentrations, but the enemy's plans were always evolving. Around midday, I spotted movement in the distance: 3 Soviet soldiers patrolling a nearby area. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. From my vantage point, they appeared to be part of a reconnaissance team, tasked with assessing our positions and gathering information. I trained my rifle on the patrol, observing their movements closely. They were moving in a zigzag pattern, a tactic designed to minimize their exposure to sniper fire. Their equipment was minimal, but they carried radios and maps, indicating their role in gathering intelligence. As I focused on the patrol, I noticed a figure emerging from the shadows of a nearby building. It was another German soldier, his uniform blending with the snow-covered landscape. He moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the Soviet patrol. I recognized him as part of a special operations unit, known for their expertise in covert operations and sabotage. The German soldier took up a concealed position behind a pile of rubble, his attention directed toward the Soviet patrol. It was evident that he intended to ambush them, but I was uncertain of his exact plan. The situation was precarious, and any misstep could alert the Soviets to his presence. I decided to monitor both the Soviet patrol and the German soldier. The patrol continued its route, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. The German soldier was preparing a small explosive device, his movements careful and deliberate. He set the device on a timer, positioning it near a key access point that the Soviets were likely to use. As the German soldier retreated to a safe distance, I continued to observe. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of the wind. The Soviet patrol approached the explosive device, their movements slow and cautious. They were likely unaware of the trap, focused on their reconnaissance mission. The timer on the explosive device reached its end, and the explosion erupted with a deafening roar. Smoke and debris filled the air, the force of the blast sending shockwaves through the factory and the surrounding area. The Soviet patrol was caught off guard, their cries of surprise lost amid the chaos. I took advantage of the confusion, lining up my shots with precision. The Soviets were disoriented, scrambling for cover amidst the wreckage. I picked them off one by one, my aim steady and deliberate. The scene was one of destruction, the remnants of the Soviet patrol strewn across the snow-covered ground. The German soldier reappeared, surveying the aftermath of the attack. His expression was one of grim satisfaction, but there was also a hint of concern. The operation had been successful, but the noise of the explosion would undoubtedly draw attention. The Soviets would respond, and we needed to be prepared for their counteraction. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, I packed up my gear and prepared to relocate. The factory was no longer safe, and the likelihood of a Soviet counterattack was high. I moved quickly, taking care to cover my tracks and avoid detection. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the battlefield in a layer of white that obscured the signs of the recent conflict. The cold was unrelenting, a constant reminder of the harsh conditions we faced daily. I made my way through the ruins, seeking out a new position where I could continue to monitor the situation. The landscape was a harsh, frozen expanse, each step crunching through the snow. The factory was now a distant memory, its walls scarred by the violence of war. I settled into a new position, a small bunker hidden among the wreckage. It offered some protection from the elements and a vantage point for observing the Soviet movements. The war was an ever-evolving struggle, each day bringing new challenges and dangers. The thin line of survival was a constant battle, and every action carried the risk of escalation. As I prepared for the days ahead, I knew that the Soviet forces would not be easily deterred. They would regroup, reinforce their positions, and retaliate with increased ferocity. The cold was harsh, the conditions unforgiving, but I was determined to endure. The days ahead promised to be even more dangerous, and I needed to remain vigilant. The Eastern Front was a brutal, unrelenting theater of conflict, and survival required both skill and resolve. As I settled into my new position, the reality of war weighed heavily on my shoulders. The battle was far from over, and the challenges of the Eastern Front would continue to test our limits. But as long as I remained resourceful and resolute, there was hope that we could navigate the complexities of the conflict and endure the harsh realities of the frozen landscape. March 1st, 1944, the tides of fate. March 1st arrived with a subtle change in the air, a tentative promise of spring that seemed almost incongruous against the backdrop of the relentless Eastern Front. The snow was starting to melt, revealing patches of dark, frozen earth beneath the layers of white. The factory ruins that had been my sanctuary for the past few days were now more exposed, their skeletal remains less effective as cover. I had relocated to a small, more discreet hideout, a half-buried bunker located in the shadows of a decimated warehouse. The bunker was a crude affair, dug into the earth and reinforced with wooden beams scavenged from nearby structures. It was colder than the factory, but offered better concealment, making it an ideal location for monitoring Soviet movements and remaining undetected. The day's operations were centered around a new intelligence-gathering mission. The Soviets were growing bolder, their patrols more frequent, and their positions more fortified. From the brief communications intercepted, I knew that they were preparing for a major push, likely intending to break through our lines and advance further into German-held territory. The bunker was cramped but functional. I had fashioned a makeshift bed from old sacks and a small heating stove that provided some relief from the cold. The view through the narrow slit in the bunker's wall allowed me to observe the surrounding area with relative safety. I spent the morning adjusting my equipment and reviewing the latest intelligence reports, piecing together the puzzle of Soviet movements and strategies. By mid-morning, I spotted a Soviet convoy approaching from the east, a slow-moving procession of trucks and armored vehicles making their way along a partially cleared road. The convoy was heavily guarded, with several infantry units accompanying the vehicles. The Soviets were clearly reinforcing their positions, and the convoy's size indicated that it was a significant supply run. I readied my rifle and positioned myself carefully to get a clear shot. The convoy was still some distance away, and I took the opportunity to observe their formation. The trucks were laden with supplies, ammunition, food, and medical equipment critical for the Soviet offensive that was clearly being planned. My focus was drawn to a particular vehicle, a command truck, distinguished by its larger size and distinctive markings. It was likely carrying key personnel and important communications equipment. Disrupting this vehicle could have a significant impact on the Soviet operation, potentially causing confusion and delay. As the convoy drew nearer, I noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The snow was beginning to fall again, a light dusting that quickly turned into a flurry. The snowfall created a curtain of white, obscuring the convoy and complicating my aim. Visibility was rapidly decreasing, and I knew that any shot I took would need to be precise. With the snow intensifying, the convoy slowed, the vehicles struggling to maintain traction on the icy road. This presented an unexpected advantage. I had more time to plan my attack. I selected my target, the command truck, and took a deep breath, steadying my aim. Just as I was about to take the shot, a new sound reached my ears, the distant rumble of engines and the crunch of boots on snow. I turned sharply, my heart racing, to see a group of German soldiers approaching. They were part of a reconnaissance unit, their presence a potential complication. They were not aware of my position, but their proximity could jeopardize my mission if they were to stumble upon the convoy or my hideout. The situation was rapidly escalating. I had to make a decision: continue with the ambush or shift my focus to the approaching German soldiers. I chose to maintain my focus on the convoy, understanding that the opportunity to disrupt the Soviet command structure was too valuable to pass up. As the convoy neared the command truck, I fired a carefully aimed shot, targeting the driver. The bullet struck its mark, and the command truck swerved violently, its occupants thrown into disarray. The convoy's response was immediate, a flurry of gunfire and frantic movements as the Soviets scrambled to identify the source of the attack. I continued to pick off targets, my shots precise and deliberate. The command truck was now engulfed in flames, its contents and personnel rendered ineffective. The convoy was in chaos, the trucks halted, and the Soviet soldiers disoriented. The snowfall thickened, obscuring the scene and adding to the confusion. In the midst of the chaos, I heard the sound of approaching vehicles. The German reconnaissance unit was closing in. I quickly packed up my gear, retreating deeper into the bunker to avoid detection. The Germans arrived at the scene, their presence adding a new layer of complexity to the situation. The German soldiers began to investigate, their voices a mix of confusion and determination. They were assessing the damage and securing the area, their presence a double-edged sword. On one hand, they would ensure that the Soviet convoy was neutralized. On the other, their investigation could reveal my position if I wasn't careful. I remained hidden, my breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. The snow continued to fall, covering the traces of the battle and muffling the sounds of movement. The German soldiers were thorough, their search methodical, but they did not uncover my hideout. As the day wore on, the convoy's remnants were secured, and the German unit began to withdraw. The snow was falling heavily now, obscuring the evidence of the recent battle. I waited until the area was clear before emerging from the bunker and surveying the scene. The Soviet convoy had been effectively neutralized, but the presence of the German reconnaissance unit had added an unexpected twist to the day's events. The snow-covered battlefield was a stark reminder of the relentless nature of the conflict. Each day brought new challenges, new dangers, and new decisions. The Eastern Front was a harsh, unforgiving theater of war, where survival required constant vigilance and adaptability. As I made my way back to a new position, the reality of the war weighed heavily on my shoulders. The battle was far from over, and the Soviets would regroup and retaliate. The thin line of survival was a constant struggle, and every action carried the risk of escalation. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the battlefield in a layer of white. It was a cold, harsh landscape, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Eastern Front. As I prepared for the days ahead, I knew that the conflict would continue to test our limits, and survival would depend on both skill and resolve. The war was an ever-evolving struggle, each day bringing new complexities and dangers. But as long as I remained resourceful and determined, there was hope that we could navigate the challenges and endure the harsh realities of the frozen landscape.